React.js. Let's talk about the TanStack query. So TanStack query, previously known as a React query, is a popular library used in React application for managing server state and handling asynchronous data fetching. It provides a set of hooks that simplify the process of fetching, caching, synchronizing, and updating data in React application. So that was just a quick definition of what a TanStack query is. But TanStack Query is also a framework agnostic, which simply means that you are not only limited to use them inside the React.js, you can use them with different frameworks and libraries like Vue.js, AngularJS, and so on and so forth. But it is commonly used in the React community. So yeah, that was just a definition of what a TanStack query is. And now let's get into the setup, then you will get to know what I'm talking about. So now let's make a setup for our coding journey. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open my terminal and I am going to make a setup for the React.js. I'll use npm create with at latest, and now I'm going to give it the name of like 10 demo or something like that, or TanStack demos would be fine. So I'll choose React.js with TypeScript. Now I'll go into the Tans demo and now I'll install every single thing inside there. Now that's successfully done, so I'll just clear this out. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to go to the TanStack query, and now we are using the version 5 of TanStack query. So they are now calling themselves like powerful asynchronous state management for TypeScript and React.js in TypeScript with JavaScript, React.js, Solid.js, Vue.js, Svelte, and also Angular. Okay, so yeah, if you want to install that, the first thing that we have to do is that we have to go ahead and go to this docs. Now here you can learn a lot of stuff about there, but I'm going to click on this installation, and now let me just copy this link, and now let's just place it right here, and I'm gonna just hit enter, so it's gonna install that in my machine. So yeah, that's totally done. Now I'm gonna go ahead and go to my tailwindcss.com and click on the getting started, go to the framework and guides, choose Vite, and now I'll just copy this line of code or command to be precise, and now let me just place it right here. So it's going to install the Tailwind CSS inside my project. So now I'm going to just hit enter, so it's going to initialize my Tailwind CSS right now. And now I'm going to just copy there, and now first of all we have to open that folder inside the VS Code, and this is how it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the Tailwind config file, and I'll just replace that content with this new one. Next, I'm going to copy this index.css directives, and now let's just go ahead and go to this index.css file, remove every single thing from there and replace it with this new one. I'm going to remove the public folder, and I'm going to also remove the ss folder, remove the app.css, go to the app.tsx file, remove every single thing from there, and I'm going to use my rfc inside there to create my initial component. Now let me just copy this line of code, and now I'm going to place it right here so that we can see everything is working or not. So I'm going to use like npm run dev, and now let's just test this out. Okay, so yeah, everything is working the way we expect him to work, and that was our entire installation. And now let's get into the TanStack query in a more great detail. Now let me show you how we are going to be fetching and managing that data without using the TanStack query, and then we are going to be refactoring that code to use the TanStack query. So what I'm going to do is that I'll just close all of that files, and here I'm going to just define a components folder, and inside there I'll just create a component with the name of like without TanStack query.tsx. I'll just use my rfc inside there, and now let's just go into the app.tsx file, and now I'm going to register that component right here. So without the TanStack query, now I'm going to save this file, and here you can see we're now getting this message, which means like everything is working the way we expect him to work. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to define my stats. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just define a stat for the id, and then set id is going to be equals to the use stat, and the initial value will be set to 1. Now I'm going to create a stat for the data, and then set data is going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to null. Yeah, definitely you can provide your TypeScript and all of that stuff, but I'm not going to. So now we are going to be creating a stat for the is loading, and also set is loading, and it's going to be equal to the use state once again, and the initial value will be set to true. Now we have to define a stat for the error, and then set error, and it's going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to totally null. Now underneath them we have to now fetch the data, so which means like we have to do some sort of a side effect. So I'll just use my use effect, and the initial value, not the initial value, but for the dependency array we are going to be only providing that id, because we are going to be creating some sort of a button, and anytime we click on that button, so it's going to fetch a new data. So now I'll just import that use effect from the React.js, And now let's just do a bit of side effects. So first of all, we have to define our race condition. So I'll just use like RC for the race condition. It's going to be set to false. And if you guys don't know what a race condition is, you don't even have to worry about that because TanStack Query will handle that behind the scene for us. So now we have to create a function. So I'll just use like handle fetch, and it's going to be equals to the asynchronous function. And now inside there, first of all, we have to get the set is loading, and we have to set that to true. Now we have to use the set error, and we have to initialize that to the null value. And now underneath there, we have to use the try and catch blocks. So for the catch block, we have to specify some sort of an error, and it can be anything. And now I'll just use like set error, and here we have to specify like error.message, and we're going to be also providing the finally. So I'll just use like finally, and here let's just use our set is loading and provide the false value to there. Okay, now for the try block, what do we have to do? We have to fetch the data. So I'll use like const trace, and it's going to be equals to await and then fetch. And here inside there, now we are going to be fetching the data from this URL, which we've already used in like almost all of my courses. So we are now fetching more data from the JSON placeholder.typicode.com/to-dos. And now we are going to be fetching that data from a specific to-do. Now underneath there, we have to take care of the race condition. So if we have the race condition, in that situation, we're going to be returning our data. But if that's not the case, we have to do a check. So if you don't have the response okay, so in that situation, we're going to be throwing a new error. Okay, so I'll use like error fetching data. Now we have to render our response.statistics like so. And now let me just save my file. And now finally, we have to convert our data to the JSON response. So I'll just use like await, then response.json. And now we have to store it in some sort of variable. So I'll use like const response, or you know what, result would be fine. And now we have to set that set data, and we have to specify the result, or all of their data to there. So now that's totally done. Now we have to execute this function. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to copy a name of there, and we have to execute this function right here. Now I'm going to also provide a cleanup function for the race condition. So I'll just return this data, and now from this data I'll use like RC for the race condition. Now it's going to fetch all of their data, and now the next thing that we have to do is that we have to render their data to our UI. So what I'm going to do is that first of all, I'm going to be checking like if we have the loading state. In this situation, we are going to be using the h1. We have to provide like loading ... And now if that's not the case and we got some sort of an error, so in that situation we are going to be using the h1, and we have to render that specific error. But if we have the data, so in that situation we are going to be only rendering their data by using their JSON stringify. So I'll use like json.stringify, and here we have to specify our data inside there. Now if I save my file, here you can see we are now getting all of their data. So if I just refresh that, we are now getting that loading loader, and also now we are getting our data, which means like everything is working the way we expect them to work. But now I'm going to be creating a button, and here for this button we are going to be just saying like next or next page, and when somebody try to click on there, then we're going to be finding this function which is a set ID. And now here we have to specify our previous ID to there, and now we have to use our previous ID +1. And also I'm going to be providing a bit of classes to this. So I'll use like pairing all around will be set to 20 rem. Now let me just save my file, and here you can see we are now getting this huge button, but you know, let's just change that to like maybe 3 rems. And now I'll also change the color of that to like background totally black and text totally white. Now let me just save my file. It is still looking supremely big. And yeah, I guess that's gonna be fine. So if I click on there, here you can see it's gonna give us another data and another ID. So if I click on there once again, it's gonna fetch our data, and now it's gonna show our data. But I want you to notice, like here you can see we have to do all of that stuff for just fetching our data. Like here you can see we have to define the state for the ID, then for the data, then for the loading, then for the errors, and also we have to take care of the race conditions. And by the way, if you guys don't know what a race condition is, you don't have to worry about that, because now TanStack Query will handle that for you, so you don't have to worry about that. Now let me just expand there. First of all, you have to take care of your loading logic, and then you have to write a lot of try and catch blocks, and then you have to even check for the responses, and then finally you have to send your data. You have to also take care for the catching, and then you have to take care for the error logic, and finally logic, and there's a lot of hurdles. And here you can see you also have to take care of the loading logic and also the data, and then finally you're going to be showing some sort of a data to your UI. So yeah, this is like cool. You totally can write your code like this, but just imagine for a second, like if you want to fetch a lot of data in a lot of components, it can get totally messy and totally tedious. So for this kind of situation, we are going to be using something called the TanStack query, and trust me, you're gonna love that a lot. So you know what, let me just refactor this code. We're not going to be refactoring this code, so we are going to be starting from scratch, and then we are going to be refactoring this code to use the TanStack query. Let's talk about that query client thing which we just saw a few seconds ago. So if you said that query client is the heart of TanStack query, you won't be wrong. You will be totally correct. But you know what, let's just explore that a bit more. So the query client is the core object in TanStack query that manages the state and configuration of queries and mutation in our applications. It serves as the primary API for interacting with the library, and by library I mean the TanStack query library, enabling us to perform actions like fetching the data, managing the cache, and setting up the global configurations. So as I said, that query client is the heart of the entire TanStack query. So yeah, let me just explore that a bit more. The first thing that we did is that we imported the query client, which is just a heart of the TanStack query. From where? From the TanStack query, from the React query. Next, we created the instance of the outside from all of our component. Here you can see there, and now we have to use that inside our entire applications. So for that we use the query client provider, which is just a context, and now it is taking the client, and now for the client we are now providing this query client. Basically all of that code simply means that we want to use that TanStack query inside our entire application. You can think about this code is like this, like basically this entire thing which we just imported, and we created the instance of that, and now we are providing the or even wrapping our entire application by using our query client provider context. This all code simply means that we want to use our TanStack query inside our entire application, and that's it. Now let's talk about the main hook from the TanStack query, which you're going to be using like 99% of your time. Maybe not 99% of your time, but I guess 70 or 80%. So I'm talking about something called the use query hook from the TanStack query. So this is how we are going to be using there. First of all, we are going to be writing the use query. It's going to take an object, and inside that object we are going to be providing a query key as a key, and for the value we are going to be providing some sort of a unique key to there. And don't you worry, because we are going to be explaining all of them one by one. And after that we are going to be using another property which is called the query function or query fn, and then we are going to be specifying some sort of a function which will allows us to fetch our data. So you know what, let me just break this down one by one. First of all, we have the use query, which is a function that help us fetch and manage server data in our applications. Then we have a query key, and then now we are specifying a to-dos to there, and you can specify anything to there, like you can specify, I don't know, it's gonna totally depend on your situation where you're using there, but in my case I'm gonna be fetching some sort of a to-dos, so that's why I specify to-dos inside there. So this is a unique identifier for the query. It's like a label saying like we are working on that specific items or that to-dos in my case. And finally we have our query function, and now we are specifying a fetch data function to there, and this specify the function which is a fetch data that will actually get the data, and it will be called to retrieve that to-do items. So yeah, that was just the basic theory about the use query hook, and now let's just use that inside our apps. Okay, so I'll just close there, and now I'm gonna go ahead and go to my components folder, and now we are going to be creating another component which will be a with TanStack query.tsx. I'll use my RFC inside there. Let's just go ahead and go to our app, comment this line out, and now we have to return the with TanStack query. So now let me just write this, save my file, close there, and here you can see we're now getting our with TanStack query, which is looking cool. The first thing that we have to do is that we have to import something called the use query function or hook. From where? From the TanStack query. So I'll use like use query, and next we have to use there. So I'll just use like use query, and inside there we have to specify our object, and for this object we are now going to be providing the query key, and that's going to be set to an array, and inside this array we are going to be specifying some sort of a unique key to there. I'm going to provide a comma. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to provide a function which will allow us to fetch our data. So we have to use our query function, and now we have to specify some sort of a function for this. So I'll use like fetch data as my function, which we are going to be creating in a few seconds. So I'll use like const data, and it's going to be equals to this use query function. And now outside from there, I'm going to just create that function right here. So I'll use like const fetch data, and it's going to be a function. It's going to be basically an asynchronous function, because now we are going to be using, or what do we call it, asynchronous operation. So that's why it's going to be an asynchronous function. And the first thing that I want to do is that I want to fetch my data. So I'll use like fetch, and we want to fetch our data from the HTTPS, and then JSON, come on, JSON placeholder dot type icode dot com/to-dos. Now let's just store the inside the response variable, and now let me just save my file. Next we have to check for the response. So if the response is not okay, so I'll use like response is not okay. In that situation, we're going to be throwing a new error, and it's going to say like network response was not okay. And finally we just have to return the response.json. So I'll use like response.json, and I'm going to execute there, and this is how we are going to be fetching our data. And by the way, I know a lot of you thought that TanStack Query is only used for fetching the data, but that's not the case. We are now fetching our data by using this fetch method. We can also use xuse for fetching the data, but TanStack Query will not only allows us to fetch our data, it's gonna also allows us to manage that data, which means like we don't have to create a state for the loading, for the errors, and so on and so forth. We don't have to specify the try and catch blocks. We don't have to take care of the race conditions and a lot of more stuff. So you know what, let me just log that data to the console. So I'll just use the console.log of data, and now let me just save my file. Now I'm gonna right click on there, go to my inspect element, go to my console. And yep, we are now getting their data right here. So there is something wrong inside the JSON placeholder. I'm not quite sure about that. So, you know, let's just close there. Here you can see I'm now providing triple T's right here. So let's just change there to this URL. So now let me just save my file, and now let me just refresh there, and here you can see we're now getting our data. So first of all, we have our data, which is now array of 200 arrays. And we also have like error, we also have the failure and is error, and we have a lot of these flags which we are going to be destructuring in a few seconds. So we also have like, is it loading or not? So currently it is not loading, so it's going to give us a false, paused or not. So yeah, this is not paused. Is it pending or not? Yep, it is not. So is it stale or not? So yeah, it is true. And stale is something which we are going to be exploring in a lot more great detail, but not right now. So we are going to be destructuring a lot of things, but now you get the idea that TanStack Query will not only allows us to fetch the data, but it's going to also allows us to manage that fetch data. So, you know, let me just close there. So to prove my point, I'm going to also install the Axios library, and I'm going to also show you that we can also fetch our data by using the Axios. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open my terminal, and if you guys don't know what Axios is, you don't even have to worry about that. So I'll just use like npm I and then Axios. So it's going to install there inside my project, and now that's totally done. So I'll use like npm run dev, and I'm going to comment this line out. And now let me just create another function which will be a fetch data, and here we are going to be using that asynchronous operation once again. Now let's just use like response and then await and Axios. Let's just get there from the Axios first of all. And now we can use the get method and so on and so forth. So I'll only use the get method, and inside this get method I'm going to copy this link, and now let me just place that link right here. And now we are going to be only returning that response right here. Okay, so yeah, or you know, it's going to be a response.data to be precise. And now we can totally log that to the console. Now let me go ahead and go to my inspect element once again and go to the console, and let's just refresh there. Now we are getting that data, we are also getting that error, and so on and so forth. So now you get the idea that here you can see we can also use Axios, we can use fetch, and we can use a lot of things. So this is how the syntax will look like. First of all, you have to import the use query, and then inside the use query you are going to be providing an object. Inside this object, the first key will be a query key, and it's going to take a unique key. You can specify like different kind of keys if you wanted to. You can provide like even a gibberish if you wanted to, and then you have to specify the query function which will allows us to fetch our data. You can definitely copy this entire thing and you can place it right here, but in my case I'm not going to, because I know it's gonna look a lot ugly, and now I'm teaching you all of that stuff. So you know what, I'm gonna have to just stick with this convention. So that's totally done, and now that you get the idea that how in the world we are going to be fetching our data. But now let me show you that we no longer have to create a state for the is loading, like we're going to be writing like is loading, and we no longer have to create a state for like is error and so on and so forth. We can totally destructure them from our TanStack query. So how in the world we are going to be doing that? We can just use this destructure method or syntax, whatever you want to call them. We can totally destructure the data, which will be the actual data which we are now fetching. We can also destructure the error, and we can also destructure the is loading, and we can do a lot of stuff. So now that we successfully destructured them, and now we can totally use that right here. So if you have some sort of an error, so I'll use like if it is loading. So in that situation, we are going to be only writing this h1, which will say like loading dot dot dot. And if you have some sort of an error, so in that situation, we are going to be only creating a paragraph. It's going to say like an error occurred at this location or at this position. So I'll write like error.message, and now let me just save my file. And finally we have our data which we can now render to our UI. So I'll just close them, and inside this div I'll just write my h1 which will be a data. Now underneath there, let's just write our pre, and here inside there I'm going to be using like json.stringify, and here we have to pass our data and null value and also our 2. Okay, so now let me just save my file, and here you can see we're now getting our data, and we have a lot of data right here. So we can now scroll through there, and now that you get the idea like how in the world we're going to be using our TanStack query to fetch our data. So yeah, it is as simple as that. Let's talk about another concept in TanStack query, which is called the deduplication. So the deduplication means that if we try to fetch the same data multiple times at once, so it will only send one request instead of many. Deduplication helps avoid asking for the same data over and over again. So that was just a quick theory about the deduplication, and now let me show you that in action. So here you can see we have our cache, which is just an object, and now we are going to be using this code to fetch our data. So now here you can see we have our use query. Inside our use query, we are now passing our query key, and for the query key we are now passing a random number. Then we have a query function which will allows us to get a random number. So in the first render we are going to be getting this random number, which is like 0.65500 and so on and so forth. But on the second render, what do you expect to get? You might be thinking like we are going to be getting some random number once again, but no, we are going to be getting that same number once again. And why is that? That's because we are now passing that random number as a query key to our use query. So which means like if we already have some sort of a data already available inside our cache, it's gonna only gives us that already available data. But if we specify some other key for our query key, then it's gonna give us another kind of random data. So if we try there once again, like for the third time, still we are going to be getting that same response. And why is that? Because it's going to go to the cache, and it's going to ask from our cache, do you have something to share with me? And it's going to say, yeah, I already have this random data. It's going to give us that random data. But if we specify some unique key for our query key, then it's going to give us a new random data. So that was just the theory of the deduplication, and now let me show you that in action. Okay guys, so now let's see the deduplication in action. So I'm going to just create a new folder with the name of components, and inside there we are going to be creating a component with the name of deduplication.tsx, and I'll use my RAFC inside there. Now let me go ahead and go to my app and just remove that app from there and provide my deduplication. Come on, duplication, save my file. And this is how it looks like right now. So the next thing that we have to do, that we have to import the use query from the React query. So I'll import the use query. We have to import them manually. So now let me go ahead and go to the TanStack query and then React query, and now we have to use that right here. So I'll use like the use query. I'm going to execute, and now inside there we are going to be providing our object, and for this object we are going to be passing a query key. And now let me just pass like their same code, like the random number. And now underneath there we are going to be just providing a query function which allows us to generate a random number. So I'll give it a name of like get random number, and now let me just provide my comma there, and from here we are going to be destructuring a few things like data, and now it's going to be equals to this use query. So now underneath that we have to render, or let's just go back for data right here. So I'll just use like data, and I'm gonna say like random number is, and now let me just save right here, save my file. And the final thing that we have to do is that we have to just create this function so that we can see the results. So I'll use like this function, and inside this function we are going to be only returning the promise. So I'll just use like promise dot resolve, and here let's just space or math dot random. Now let me just execute this, save my file, and here you can see we're now getting this random number. But now if I go ahead and go to my app component once again, and if I just duplicate this, save my file, here you can see still we are now getting that same number as compared to the first one. And why is that? That's because of the deduplication. And now let me show you the TanStack Query dev tools in action. So I'll use like TanStack Query, and I'm going to go ahead and go to there, and here you can see we have our dev tools. So I'll just choose there, and the first thing that we have to do is that we have to install there. So I'm going to copy this command, and now let me open my terminal, and I'm going to make that a bit bigger. And now let's just stop there, and here we have to just use this command and hit enter. So it's going to install the TanStack Query dev tools inside our project. Now that's totally done. I'm going to use npm run dev once again. Now let me go ahead and go to my main, and here we have to import there. So I'll just import that right here. I'll use like import the React Query dev tools, and now let me just hit enter. So it's going to import that right here. Next we have to use so that we can see that in action. So I'll use like React Query dev tools, and now let me just close that, and here for the initial is open, we are going to be setting there to false. So now let's just save our file. I'm going to open my local host right here, and here you can see we're now getting our icon. So if I click on that, it's going to give us their dev tools right here. So we can now filter stuff, we can see the sort status, we can do a lot of stuff with there, like whether something is styled or not styled or something like that. So yeah, that was a TanStack Query dev tools. Let's talk about the stale time. So the stale time refers to the duration during which the cache data is considered fresh, and during this period the data is served from the cache without triggering the background refetch, which can improve the performance and reduce unnecessary network requests. I know that was a lot of gibberish which I just said, but you don't have to worry about that. So if you get it, cool. If you don't get it, you don't have to worry about it, because now I'm going to give you an example which will help you a lot. So I want you to imagine for a second that you're using some kind of a social network application. Suppose you're using either Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or X or whatever you want to call that. You are using that for 5 minutes. So in that 5 minutes, you are now getting something called the stale data. You are now getting that data which is already available inside your cache. So stale simply means that you are now getting outdated data. But suppose if you want to get a new data, so for that you will need to refresh your page. So if you refresh your page, it's going to give you something called the fresh data, which simply means the new data. So stale data refer to the outdated data, and fresh data refer to the new data. As simple as that. So now let me just write some code, and then you will get to know what I'm talking about. So now let me show you the stale time in action. So I'm going to go ahead and define another component with the name of stale time.tsx, and I'll use my RAFC inside there. Go to my app and register this component right here. So I'll comment that line out, and I'll use my stale time and close it. Save this file. So now we are getting a stale time. I'm going to also open my dev tool so that we can see everything a bit better. Okay, so that's totally done. And now I'm gonna go a bit fast because I don't want to waste a lot of your time, because we already covered all of that stuff. So I'll use like data and then error. Also the is loading from where? From the use query. And now let's just import that from our TanStack query. It's gonna take the query key, and for the query key we have to specify what to do. And I'm gonna also provide the query function, and here it's gonna be set to the fetch data function. Now let's just save our file and go back. And here we have to create our fetch function. So I'll use like fetch data, and it's going to be equals to this asynchronous function, and inside there we have to get our response. So we are going to be using the fetch right like so, and we are going to be fetching our data from this URL. Now let's just store that inside the response variable, and I'm going to check if we don't have the response done. Okay, so just throw this new error, and it's going to say like network response was not okay. and I'm gonna also return the response okay. Not okay, but JSON, and this is how we are going to be fetching our data. And now let me just also render that data right here, but first of all we have to check for the loading state. So if you have some sort of a loading state, in this situation we are going to be using h1. It's gonna say like loading dot dot dot, and also we have to check for the error. So if we got some sort of error, then we are going to be returning this h1 once again, and error at this error dot message. Now let's just save our file, and finally we have to render our data. So I'll just use my h1 and I'll just write my data, and I'm going to also write a pre, and here we have to just use our what do we call it, JSON dot. And now I'm going to close that. Here we have to specify our data, null value and 2. Now let me just save my file, and here you can see we're now getting our data. So now let's just refresh there, and I'm going to also close there for a few seconds so you guys can see everything a bit better. So now let me just refresh there, and what are we getting? We are now getting our stale data. So how do I know this is a stale data? Here you can see we are now getting our to-dos, which means like this is already available inside our cache. So if I hover my mouse over to there, it's going to give us that this is a stale data, which means like this is already available inside our cache. So if I want to provide my own stale time, I can totally do that. Let's suppose I know that I have some sort of an application in which will not fetch our data that quickly, so I can totally specify my stale time right here. So I'll use like stale time, and here we can specify our milliseconds and minutes and something like that. So I'll only specify like 5000, only wait for 5 seconds, and then it gives us our stale data. So now let me just save my file, and now let's just refresh there, and here you can see it's gonna give us first of all the fresh data for 5 seconds, and after 5 seconds is gonna give us a stale data, or our data will become a stale. This is how you can say that. So you know what, that's a lot of talking. So now let me just refresh there once again. So currently my data will be fresh, and after 5 seconds my data will become stale. So yeah, there was a stale time, and you can specify like 5 million or billion or something like that, but in my case I'm gonna only specify like 5000 for 5 seconds. Let's talk about the refetch interval. So the refetch interval is an option used to automatically fetch data at specified interval. So it allows us to keep our data fresh without requiring a minimal intervention. So which simply means in some situation we would want to fetch our data after some delay or after some time. So for that kind of situations, you're going to be using the refetch interval. So you know what, let me just show you that in action, then you will get to know what I'm talking about. Okay, so now let's get into it. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to create my component with the name of refetch interval. I guess that's going to be fine.tsx. So I'll use my RAFC. Inside there, go to my app and register that component right here. So we have a refetch interval. So let's just import that, close this, save my file, and now we are getting our refetch interval, which means like everything is working the way we expect him to work. So first thing first, I'm gonna go ahead and just define a state for the current ID, then set current ID, and it's gonna be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to 1. Now we are going to be using our use query to fetch our data, not queries, but just a use query. So let's just go back. I'll use my use query and grab there from the TanStack Query and provide the query key, and here is going to be set to the to-dos, or to do rather, and here we are going to be also passing the current ID for the unique ID. Okay, so let's just provide our comma and provide a query function which will allows us to fetch our data. So I'll use like fetch to do, and here we have to pass our current ID inside there. Okay, so I'm going to also destructure a few things. So I'll just destructure first of all the data, then the error, and finally the loading. So is loading, god damn it, is loading, like so it's going to be coming from the use query. Now let me just define this function right here. So I'll just place this coding. We are not doing anything crazy, but it is now taking ID, and now we are passing that ID to that specific to do, and based on that ID we are now getting that specific to do. Okay, so that's totally done. So I'm going to also hide there. And now let's just use the inside our UI, but first of all we're going to be using the use effect for the side effect. So I'll use like use effect, and here what I'm going to do is that let's just provide our function, and here it's going to take the dependency array of empty dependency array. Now we have to get the set interval and pass our arrow function inside there, and it's going to say like set current ID, and we have to provide our previous ID, that's going to be set to previous id is less than 200. Now we are assuming that the data which we are now fetching is equal to 200 items. But if that's not the case, so in that situation we are going to be using our previous id plus 1. But if that's also not the case, so we are going to be only returning 1. Okay, and here we also have to specify 5 seconds for the interval. So I'm going to store the inside a variable, so I'll use like interval is going to be equals to this set interval. And finally we have to just clean this up, so I'll use like return. And now inside there we have to use our clear interval and pass our interval inside there. So it's gonna just clean up our interval, or you can say that it's gonna unmount our interval. So let's just hide there. Now we have to check for the loading and also for the errors, right? So if we have the loading, so in that situation we are going to be returning our h1. So let's just use our h1, and it's gonna say like loading 1, loading dot dot dot. And also we have to check for the error if we got one. So in that situation we are going to be returning h1, and error we have to render our error right here. Okay, so that's also done. Now we have to go to our UI, and inside this UI, so I'll just write h1 of to do, and here we have to use our not pre but pre, there we go, and render our to do's inside this. So I'll use like json.stringify and pass our data, null value, and also second. And then we have to create a button, and this button will say gives us a next to do. And also when somebody clicks on there, we are going to be firing this function which will just change the set current id. Inside there we are going to be passing our previous id. Come on, previous id. And what do we have to do? We have to just use our previous id is less than 200. In that situation we are going to be using our previous id plus 1. But if that's not the case, we are going to be only using 1. Okay, so that's totally done. Now here you can see we are now getting their data. If I click on this button, so it's going to give us another data, but in some situation we would want to fetch our data in some specified interval. So for that situation we are going to be using another option or another property which is called the refetch interval. So I'll use like refetch interval, and here we can specify the duration. So I'll just use like 5 seconds. So now if I save my file, and now I'm going to just refresh there and wait for 5 seconds. So 2, 3, 4, 5, and bang, it's going to give us a new data. Now I can wait for 5 more seconds, and it's going to give us more data, and so on and so forth. I am not clicking on that button. It is now refetching that data again and again by itself, and that's because of this refetch interval property. In some situation we would want to fetch our data from multiple endpoints at once, like for example from the to-dos, from the comments, from the post, and so much more. So how can you go about doing that? By using the TanStack Query. And TanStack Query already have a hook for that, which is called the use queries. So the use queries is a hook that allows us to execute multiple queries in parallel and manage their result in a unified way. This is useful when you need to fetch data from multiple sources or endpoints in a single component, but want to handle each query set separately. For example, loading error data while keeping the queries independent. So this is just a use queries, and now let me show you how the syntax will look like. So first of all, we would need to call our use queries hook, and it's gonna also take an object as a parameter, and inside that object we're going to be passing something called the queries array. Okay, so inside that array we have to specify the query key. For each endpoint we are going to be passing an object, and inside each endpoint we are going to be passing the query key and some unique key for that query, and also a unique function which will allows us to fetch that specific item from that specific source. Okay, so we can now fetch our data from the to-dos, from the post, from the comments, and so much more. So that was just a theory about the use queries, and now let's get into the coding, then you will get to know what I'm talking about. Let's suppose if I want to fetch my data from both of these endpoints, like for example from the post and also from the to-dos. So how in the world we are going to be doing there? By using the TanStack Query, and that's totally simple and easy. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to create another component with the name of fetch from multiple endpoints.tsx, and I'll use my RAFC inside there. Now let me go ahead and register there right here. So I'll just return my fetch from multiple endpoints, and now let me just close this file, save my now let me just close this, save my file, close this out, And here you can see we are now getting our label, which means like everything is working the way we expect him to work. So what I want to do is that I want to define two states. So I'll use like first of all the current to do ID and then set current to do ID, and it's going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to 1. Okay, we are going to be also creating another state for the current post ID. So I'll use like post ID and then set current post ID, and it's going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be also set to 1. Now we are going to be fetching our data from multiple endpoints by using the use queries hook. So I'll use like use queries, and now if I hit enter, so it's going to import the from the TanStack Query React.js, or React Query to be precise. Okay, so now I'm going to execute there, and inside there it's going to take an object, and inside that object we're going to be specifying the queries, or maybe this is totally optional, but we can totally provide the options for there. So in this situation we're not going to be providing any options to there, but I'll just provide my object, and inside this object now we are going to be passing our queries. So I'll use like queries, and now here there's going to be an array, and inside this array we can specify our endpoints from where we want to fetch our data. So first of all I want to fetch my data from the post, then I want to fetch my data from the to-dos. So I'll just provide my query key, and the query key will be in this situation a to-dos, and also I'm going to specify my function which we did not create not yet, but we will create that in a few seconds. So I'll use like fetch to-dos, and that's done. Okay, now we are going to be also fetching our data from the query key. Let's just provide there. We are going to be also fetching our data from the post, and we are going to be also providing our query function to there. So I'll just give it the name of like fetch post, and now let me just save my file. Now that we specify our queries, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to create this function. So our fetch to do's and also our fetch post. I'm going to also store that in some sort of a variable, so I'll just give it the name of like I don't know, maybe a results would be fine. It's going to be equals to this use queries. Okay, now let me go ahead and just create this function right here, which one allows us to fetch our data. So I'll use like fetch to do's, and here there's going to be an asynchronous function, so I'll just mark that as an async function, and here this is fetch our data. I'm going to store the inside the response, so I'll use like await and then fetch my data by using just a fetch. So I'll use like fetch. You can also use the xuse if you wanted to, and now we are going to be fetching our data from this endpoint. Okay, and now let's just check if we don't have response.ok. So in that situation we are going to be throwing a new error, and I'll just say like network response was not okay. But if that's not the case, we are going to be only returning the response.json. And now let me just execute this, save my file, and it's gonna allows us to fetch our data from this endpoint right here. Let me just highlight that. It's gonna allow us to fetch our data from only the to-dos. Now if you want to fetch our data from the fetch post as well, so well we have to just create this same function. Now let me just duplicate that. I'm going to change the name of this function to fetch post, and now we are going to be also changing that from the to-dos to post, and that's going to be it. That's all the thing that we have to do right now. Now you can log that data to the console. So I'll just write like console.log of results, and I'm going to also provide a bit of separator so we can see that, and I'll just save my file right. So we prevented your connection to JSON placeholder.type by code because it was dangerous. Type malicious. This malicious software that would harm your data, computer, or network. God damn it. You know what? Let me just test this out because I'm not building in the production, but you saw that. Okay, like this API is not secure. So it will install some malicious data in your computer, and it will try to hack your computer, or maybe I don't know, but from my antivirus software. But you know what? Now let me just refresh there, and here you can see we're now getting two datas. So the one will be from the to-dos, and if I expand there, so here you can see we are now getting different to-dos, and also one will be from that post. So now let me just expand there, and we can check this data out, and these are all the posts. Okay, so now I can totally render my data inside my UI. So this is how we are going to be fetching data from multiple endpoints, and now we have to render them inside our UI. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just destructure the to-dos query and also the post query from the results. So I'll just destructure there from the to-dos query and also from the post query. It's going to be coming from this result. So now that we successfully fetched there, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to just check for the lowering state. You don't have to do that if you don't want to do that, but I want to do that. So I'll write my to-dos query dot is loading, and then loading, or post query dot is loading. If one of these states are loading, so in that situation we are going to be just returning some sort of a loader, so I'll just write like loading dot dot dot. And we also don't have to provide these curly braces because we can also do that in one liner. So that's totally done. We can also check for the errors if we got some, so I'll just use like to-dos query dot error or post query dot error. Okay, so in that situation we are going to be only returning a div, and this div will say like an error occurred or something like that, and then we are going to be just rendering our error. So to-dos query dot error, if we have the error, then we want to show only the message of that error. But if that's not the case, we are going to be also checking for the post query dot error if we got the error from there. So in that situation we are going to be getting our message. That's also done. Now finally we have to just extract their data from our post query and also from our to-dos query. So first of all, let me just get their data. So I'll just use like to-dos query, and then we are going to be storing there inside the to-dos. Come on, to-dos data, and it's going to be equals to that data. Now let me just duplicate that and change that to post query. So I'll use like post query, and here we also have to change that to post data. Now let me just save this file, and finally we have to render that inside our UI. Okay, so I'll just write my h1 of to-dos or something like that. I'll also write my pre, okay, because here we are now rendering our data as a JSON format. So I'll just use like json.stringify, and here I can just say like to-dos data. Come on, it should be 1t, not twice. So I'm gonna have to remove 1t from there. So to-dos data dot find, here we have to specify the to-do, and then to-do can be basically anything. So I'll just write like to-do and any. You can specify the type there, but I don't have a lot of time. So I'll use like to-do.id. If that's triple equals to that current ID, which we are creating right here, which is now initially set to 1. So if that is the case, so in that situation, what do we have to do? We have to return that data. I'm gonna also specify the null and also the second parameter for my stringify. That's also done. And finally, we also have to create a button which will allows us to get new data. So I'll use like button, and I'll say like next to do. And here we are going to be also attaching a function, but you know what, we're going to be doing that in a few seconds. And here you can see we are now getting our to-dos, and this is our first to-do. And I'll also provide a bit of styling to this. So I don't know, maybe background will be set to totally teal for 300, and the text will be set to totally white maybe. And yeah, we are getting our button, but it should be maybe, I don't know, maybe 700 would be fine. Okay, 700, and now that's looking, yeah, not better, but it is looking. So yeah, I guess that 2 would be fine, and this is looking better. Now we have to attach a function for this button. So when somebody clicks on there, then we want to fire this function, which is a handle next to do click. And now let me copy the name of that, go to the top and create that function right here. Okay, so I'll just define my function. We are not going to be doing anything crazy, but we are going to be just getting new data. So I'll just write like set current to-dos. Come on, set. Why am I not getting? Oh, that's because I'm creating the outside. My bad. So we have to define this function right here, and I'll use like set current, and I'll use like set current to-dos, not post, but to-do ID. And here we have to specify our previous ID, and then we are going to be using like met.minimum and provide our previous ID plus 1, and also the to-dos data dot length. Okay, so what the hell is going on? So I'll use like length, and now let me just save my file. And here you can see the user ID is 1 and the ID is also 1, and this is the title. But now if I click on there, and it's gonna give us a new data, but I don't know why it is not giving us there. Let me just go ahead and go to my console, and we are now getting some sort of an error. If I click on there, it should be getting us a new data. Why it's not working? So let's just go back a bit. I'm going to clear this out, and now I want to click on there, and it's not working. And I know why it's not working, because I spent a lot of time figuring out what the hell did I did wrong. And here you can see we are now passing a current post ID, and it shouldn't be a post ID, it should be a current to do ID. Now let me just paste my current to do ID, save my file, and now let me just refresh there, and I want you to watch what happens. So if I click on there, it's going to give us the second ID, and also it's going to change the title. Let me just click on there once again, and it's going to give us new data anytime I click on there. That's totally done. But I also want to render my data from the post. So it's going to be quite simple and easy. So we just have to create h1 once again, and I will also provide a bit of brs and also hrs right here, and I'll just say like this is a post, so I'll use like posts. And now underneath there we are going to be using our pre once again, and now let's just use our json.stringify, and here we have to specify our post. Come on, here we have to specify or post.id, post data.find, and now here is going to take a post, and there's going to be any, and now we are going to be checking if post.id is triple equals to the current post id. So in this situation we are going to be getting our data. I'm going to also specify a null and also second for the json stringify, and it should be inside there. There we go. So that's totally done. And now underneath there we are going to be also creating our button, so I'll just create that button which will say like next post, and now let me just save there. And we are not getting anything, we are only getting our post 2. I don't know why, but that from here, and we have to paste there right in here. There we go. And now let me just close that, save my file right now, and we are now getting all of our data. So now we are getting our to-dos, and also we are getting our post. But now if I click on that, nothing will happen because we have to attach our event handler. And also I'm going to just copy all of these styling from there. Let me just paste this styling right here, and also when somebody clicks on there we want to fire this function which is a handle next post. Come on, post click. Okay, so now let me just copy a name of there and go to the top and create that function right here. So we are not going to be doing anything crazy, but I'll just create this function right here, and inside this function we are going to be using set current post ID in that situation. And now we have to provide our previous ID, and if mat.minimum previous ID plus 1, and also we have to render our post data.length. Okay, so now let me just save my file, and if I click on this, so it's going to give us a new post right here. And also if I click on this data, so it's going to give us a new to do. So this is how we are going to be fetching our data from multiple sources or multiple endpoints at once by using the use queries hook. Now let's talk about the use mutation hook. So the use mutation hook is used to handle mutative operations. So what are mutative operations? Mutative operations are creating, updating, or deleting data on either the backend or the remote server. So unlike the use query, which we just saw a few seconds ago, which is used for fetching or caching the data, now we are going to be learning about the use mutation, so which is specially designed for actions that changes the data, like either create, update, or delete that specific data. So how the syntax will look like? First of all, we are going to be using the use mutation hook, and we are going to be passing a function which will allows us to mutate or change that specific data. Then we are going to be passing an options object, and inside there we can pass like on mutate, and this function will be called before the mutation function is fired. And also we are going to be passing the on error, which will allows us to handle the error cases. Then we have the on success, which will allows us to handle the success cases. And also we have the on settled, which will be called once the mutation either succeed or fails. So that's just a basic theory of what a use mutation is. But now let's get into the coding, then you will get to know what I'm talking about. Now let's see the use mutation in action. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to define another component with the name of mutating data.tsx would be fine. I'll use my RFC inside there and register there right in here. So I'll use like mutating data. Now let me just render that to the DOM. And here you can see we are now getting our data, which means like everything is working the way we expect him to work. So inside there, we're going to be first of all getting our query client. So I'll use like use query client. Let's just get there, and I'm going to store them inside the query client function, or not a function, but inside the query client variable. And I'm going to also define my state. So I'll give it the name of like title and then set title, and it's going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to empty string. That's like there. Now let me go ahead and go to my UI. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just create my h1, which will be a create new to do would be fine. And now underneath there we are going to be creating our form. So this form will not take any action, but it will take the on submit. So when somebody submit this form, we're going to be firing this function which is a handle submit. And you know what, we're going to be doing that a bit later because now it's going to give us a lot of errors. So now inside there we are going to be creating our input field with the type of text. I'm going to also specify the value, and we are going to be getting the title. And now let's just paste that value inside there. Okay, so we are going to be also passing the on change. So then we are going to be using the set title, and here we have to pass our event.target.value, inside there. And also for the placeholder, we are going to be passing like add or enter, and that's totally done. Now underneath there, we are going to be creating our button which allows us to add. I'm gonna also pass the type, and the type will be set to totally submit. Come on, what the hell? Submit like that, and now if I save my file, that's totally done. And here you can see we are now getting our input field and also our buttons. So you know what, let me just provide a bit of styling today. So for the classes, I'll just provide like border. It's gonna be add. Yeah, I guess that's looking cool. And for the styling, we are going to be only attaching like background totally black off. Yeah, I guess that would be fine. And text will be set to totally white. And yeah, that's totally cool. We don't have to care about the styling for now. And now when somebody try to submit this form, so I'll use like on submit, then we are going to be firing this function which we are going to be creating in a few seconds. Now let me go ahead and go to the top, and here we are going to be creating that function like handle submit. It's going to take that event and it's going to be coming from the react.js.form event. Come on, like that. And that's totally done. We also have to provide the HTML form element as our generic, and now inside there we have to use our event.prevent default, and that's going to be done. We're going to be also checking if the title.trim value, like if we don't have any spaces, or if we do have any spaces, then we are going to be only returning that. That's totally done. And now here we have to somehow mutate our data or send our data like so. So how in the world we are going to be doing that? Let's just see how we can do that. The first thing that I want to do is that I want to define my own interface for the to do. So I'll use like interface to do, and here inside there, let's just provide our ID, and that's going to be optional. And we have to provide a number, then we have to provide the title, and the title will be string. We also have to provide the completed, and that's going to be a boolean. Now let me just save there. And now we are going to be using that to do again and again for the TypeScript. So now here we have to use our use mutation, which will be coming from the TanStack query. So it did not import there. Okay, it did. So now we are going to be using that right here. So it expects two arguments. So if I hover my mouse over to there, so it takes the mutation function, and also it takes the options. So let me just paste that right here. So now let me provide my object, and inside this object we are going to be passing the mutation function, which will allows us to change your data. So we are going to be creating this function in a few seconds, but I'm going to just paste it right here like post the to do, because we want to post there to do. And next we have to provide our options. So when we successfully add our to do, so in that situation, what do we have to do? I'll just use something called the query client.invalidate queries. So what in the world is that invalidate queries, and why should you want to care about that? So when a new to do is added, calling the invalidate query, and we also have to paste the to-dos inside there, ensures that the next time you access that to-do, they will be fetched from the server, including the newly added to-do as well. It is just used for the better experience, and you don't even have to worry about that. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just pass my to-do right here, which we just created a few seconds ago. So we are now passing there right here, and now we have to store that in some sort of a variable. So I'll just give the name of like a result, and that's going to be done. Now we have to create this post to do, which will allows us to post our data. So I'm going to go to the top, and now let's just create our post to do. So I'll use like post to do, and it's going to take an asynchronous function, and now we have to provide our new to do today, and that's going to be that to do. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just write my await fetch, and now we are going to be changing our data from this URL from / to do's. Okay, and also we have to provide our options. So we are going to be adding that options in a few seconds, but first of all we have to store them inside the response variable, like so response is going to be equals to that await and that fetching data. And now we have to provide our response. And by the way, you are not only limited to use the fetch, you can use xuse, you can use whichever kind of solution that you prefer, but I'm using the fetch because I know a lot of you know JavaScript, but a lot of you don't know what xuse and all of that new stuff is. So that's the only reason I'm using fetch. But if you know something else, like some other library, you can definitely use that inside your fetching data or mutating data. So I'll just give it the option of method, and here we have to pass our post as a method, and also we have to provide our headers, and for these headers we are going to be setting that to content type. Come on, content, that's going to be set to application/json. And now for the body, we are going to be adding that newly created body. So I'll just use like json.stringify and then that new to do. Okay, so it should be to do like so. There we go. And now what do we have to do? We have to check for the response. So if we don't have the response dot okay, So in that situation, what do we have to do? We have to throw a new error. So I'll use like throw new error, and it's gonna say like network response was not okay. But if that's not the case, we are going to be only returning response not okay, and I mean like not okay, but JSON. There we go. God damn it, JSON, there we go. And now we have to execute there, and this is how we are going to be fetching our data. First of all, we have to tell like where we want to fetch our data, then we have to provide which HTTP method we want to use, then we also have to provide our headers, and finally we have to add a new data which will allow us to add a new data. So now let me just close there, and even I'm gonna also close there. So it's gonna give us that result, and now we are getting a lot of stuff. Now it is giving us an error. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to add my error or to do. There we go. So now it's going to just remove that error, and now let me console log that result to the console. So I'll use like result. Now let me just close this, save my file, go into the inspect element, go to the console, and now let me just refresh there. Now it's going to give us that object. So inside this object we have the context. Let me just make the a bit bigger so you guys can see everything a bit better. So inside there we have our context, data, error, and we have a lot of things, but the only thing we are now interested in is only the data, also the error, and also that muted function. By using this muted function, it's gonna allow us to change our data. So we would need that error, we would also need this muted function, and we would need the status. So if we can find there, okay, there we go. So we would also need that status as well. So now let's just use that. I'm going to close there. Now let me just remove there, and here we are now going to be destructuring the muted function, which will allow us to mutate or change our data. We also have to access or destructure the error and also the status from there. Okay, so now let's just use the inside our UI, but first of all we have to mutate our data. So I'll just remove that from here. Now we are going to be using that muted function, and now we are going to be passing a title, the completed flag. Come on, the completed will be now set to totally false. And now underneath there we have to use our set title and make that as a totally empty string. Now I'm gonna go to the bottom, and here we have to do a lot of things. So let's just remove there. Here first of all we have to provide our status. So if your status is equal to pending, so in that situation we are going to be providing the label of adding ... If that's not the case, so I'll just provide like add to do. Now let me just save my file, and now underneath there we also have to take care of the errors. So if we have some sort of an error, in that situation we are going to be just writing our h1, and I will say like an error occurred or something like that. And now let's just render our error dot message right here. And now underneath there we also have to check for the status once again. So if our status is set to success, in that situation we are going to be just providing a label. I'll say like, come on, successfully. There we go. And now let me just save my file, and now we are going to be adding a new to do. So I'm going to go to the inspect element, then I'm going to go to the network tab, and now we are going to be adding a new to do. So I'll just write like new to do, and now if I click on the add to do, and it's gonna give us the 201 and also the 204, so which means like our new to do is successfully added right here. I'm now providing a new to do, and here you can see it is now set to post. We are now posting that data to their to-dos, and it is now successfully created. We can also see the preview, and everything is working the way we expect him to work. We can also click on these dev tools, and here we are going to be going into this mutation. Now I'll just add something else like something else. Okay, so if I click on there, and here you can see it's going to add there right here. So if I click on there, you can see more details right here. So variables are title, something else, and completed is now set to false. The context is set to null, and we have all of that data which you can see by yourself. So that was amazing, and this is how we are going to be adding a new to do by using the use muted hook. Okay, so welcome to the last topic of this course, which is called the pagination. So let's just create the pagination penguin.tsx, and I'll use my RAFCE inside there. Save this file, go to the app and register there right here. So I'll use like pagination, and I'm gonna close that, save this file, and here you can see we're now getting our pagination, which means like everything is working the way we expect them to work. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to create my current page. So I'll use like current page, and then set current page, and it's going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to now, I mean like 1, and then we are going to be also creating a page size. So I'll use like page size, and it's going to be set to 10 pages. 10 data per page would be fine. That's already done. Now we have to fetch our data by using the use query. So I'll use like use query, not queries, but just a, god damn it. Let's just remove that and get our data by using the use query, singular, not plural. I can't even speak that word. And we have to specify the query key, and the query key will be set to to-dos and also the current page. And we are going to be also providing our query function, and this query function will allows us to fetch our data. So I'll use like fetch to do's, and here we have to pass our current page and also the page size like so. And now we have to store them in some sort of a variable, or you know what, we are going to be destructuring our data right away. We don't want to store them in the variables because we already know what we are going to be getting. So we are going to be getting the data, also the error, and also the is loading from the use query. Now let me just create that function. So I'll use like const fetch to do's, and here is gonna be an asynchronous function. So it's gonna take a page, and the default value will be set to 1, and it's gonna also take the limit, and the default value will be set to only 10. Okay, so now let me just save my file, and now let's just fetch our data. So I'll use like await and fetch, and here inside there we are going to be doing a bit of magic. Now that we already know that where we are going to be fetching our data, which means like we are going to be fetching our data from this URL. So we are going to be fetching our data from the JSON placeholder dot type icode.com/to-dos and question mark. We are going to be getting our data from the page, and page will be now set to this dynamic page, which we are now taking as a parameter, and now we are passing a value for them, which is now set to only 1. Okay, so we are going to be passing the data totally dynamically. So I'll use like page and it's gonna also take the limit, and the limit will also be totally dynamic. So I'll use like limit, and this is how we are going to be fetching our data. This is going to be the URL by which we are going to be fetching our data, and it takes a page, like from which page you want to fetch your data. So we want to fetch our data from this first page. It is now taking this page as a parameter, and we are now providing the default value of 1 to there. But we are going to be also changing this page whenever we click on the next button. So for there we already defined our state, and we provided the initial value of 1 to there, and now we are passing that current page as a first parameter to this fetch to do's, and it is now taking there right here, and we are also providing the 1 as a default value to there. Next we have the limit, like how much data you want to get from this use fetch. So we initially specify the initial value of 10 to there, but we are going to be also changing, I mean like we are not going to be changing there, but the initial value we now specify 10 to there. Okay, and now we are just rendering the 10 item right here. So now let me just remove these empty spaces from here because they are annoying and we have to store them in some sort of variable. So like response would be fine, and now let me just save them. And now we have to check. So if we don't have the response done okay, so in that situation we are going to be throwing a new error. So throw the throw new error. It's gonna say like network response was not okay. There we go, and return response.json and execute that. Now let me just save my file, and that's totally done. Now we have to take care of the loading and also the error state. So if we have the is loading, so in that situation we are going to be returning our h1, and it will say like loading dot dot dot. And if we have the error, so in that situation we are going to be returning our h1, and I will say like an, or you know what, just error would be fine, and I will just render my error dot message right here. Save this file. Now let me go ahead and go to my UI and provide my UI right here. So for this h1 I'll select to do's, and for the prev I'll just render my data right here. So I'll use like json.stringify and provide my data null value and 2. Now underneath there we are going to be also creating our previous button and also our next button. So I'll just create my div, and inside this div we are going to be creating our button which will say like previous or previous page, and we're going to be also creating yet another button which will say like next page. So that's totally done. So when somebody clicks on this button, so we have to get the previous data. So we are going to be using like handle previous page, and also we have to disable that if our current page is equal to 1. So we are going to be disabling that button. And also when somebody clicks on this next page button, so in that situation we are going to be firing this function which is a handle next page. And now let's just create both of these functions right here. I'll start by defining this function which is a handle previous page, and I'll use like const handle previous page, and inside there we have to use our set current page, and here we have to pass our previous page like so. Now we are going to be using mat.maximum or max. Here we have to provide our previous page. Just remove one from there, and for the second parameter we are going to be passing 1 to there. That's totally done. Now we have to create our handle next page, and we have to define there right here. So I'll use like cons handle next page, and inside there we are going to be using our set current page, and it's going to take the previous page, and we have to just add 1 to their previous page. So it's going to give us like basically the next item, and it's going to give us the previous item. Now we are getting all of their to-dos, and we have 10 items right here. And let's just style these buttons so that we can see them a bit better. And I'll provide like, I don't know, background color detail of 300. I guess that's going to be fine. And I'm going to also provide margin for the bottom of 10 maybe. Yeah, that's totally looking cool. And padding all around will be set to 3. Yep, that's looking cool. I'm going to basically copy all of that styling and put that right here. Remove that margin for the bottom and change the color to crimson. 300. Oh, not a crimson, but I don't know, maybe cyan. God, we have a lot of colors in Tailwind CSS, and I can't even choose one from them. Oh my god. Let's just search for a color. I guess purple would be fine. And yeah, we are now getting our purple button, which is looking cool. If I click on there, so it's load our data. Now it's going to give us 11, 12 till 20. And now if I click on this previous page, so it's going to give us that 10, and it's going to start from the 1, and then it's going to go through 10. If I click on there once again, it's going to give us 20 more item. If I click on there once again, so it's going to give us a loader. It's going to start from 21. It will go to 30 item, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So this is how we are going to be performing a pagination in TanStack Query.